There's some breaking news out there that I want to address because it has to do with Tennessee's 2025 season and beyond. ESPN's Chris Lowe is reporting the Vols and Tim Banks, Tennessee's defensive coordinator, close to finalizing an extension for him to remain with the Vols as defensive coordinator. I've been told Clemson and Miami made a pretty significant run. Jimmy, this is big for Tennessee. I think the three most important coaches on Tennessee's staff, and I don't even think it's close, Rodney Garter, Tim Banks, Josh Hyde.
Yeah, and I think it's big that Banks stays. Look, their defense last year ranked in the top 5 in the SEC in like 5 different major categories in 2023. And then they were even better in 2024, whether it was points allowed, run defense, total defense, third down efficiency, tackles for loss. They were really good in those areas 2 years in a row. And now Banks had 2 bad games last year, Ohio State and Georgia. I didn't think he did a very good job in either one of those games. But I think he did a pretty dang good job in just about every other game that they had. And that's one reason they won 10 games. They didn't win 10 games without the defense playing at that level. So I think keeping Tim Banks is absolutely huge for the staff.
Jimmy, sticking on Tim Banks with that, looking at him as a whole, you brought up he had 2 bad games, Georgia and Ohio State. Those are also the 2 really only competent passing offenses Tennessee played last year. So
also the 2 most talented teams Tennessee played last year, Caleb. I don't know where you're going, but I think that's worth mentioning.
Yeah, and it seemed like, I'm wondering one of 2 things: was he just out coached by Mike Bobo and Chip Kelly, or did we and he overestimate his defensive line because he didn't bring any pressure in those games at all? And the defensive line was not getting the pressure that they were getting on other teams throughout the year. So did he misevaluate his defensive line? And is that a concern?
I don't. When you say misevaluate, you're talking about pass rush.
Yeah, I think he thought they were good enough to get pressure on good teams without a blitz.
Well, I did too, because I thought James Pearce was NFL caliber. I thought Joshua Joseph was really good. I thought Omar Norman-Lott was one of the best pass rushing defensive tackles Tennessee's had, one of the best in the SEC. So I thought just among that 3 that they would be able to get pressure without blitzing. And as it turned out against Georgia, they couldn't. As it turned out against Ohio State, they didn't. Now, I thought against Ohio State, they got soundly outcoached because Ohio State, here's my definition of that. If they keep running the same play and having success every time and you don't adjust, you got outcoached. So what did Tennessee do defensively whenever Ohio State ran a drag route with a receiver? They never defended it. What did they do when they had a running back just sneak out of the backfield and dump it off to him for an 8 or 10 yard game on 3rd and 6? They never defended it. That to me is getting out coached. With Georgia, they didn't put pressure on Beck. Now, Beck was kind of interesting because going into that game, he had played poorly. Well, between average and poorly for like 5 games in a row, right? And so, but I would have brought the heat on him. I didn't understand that. I don't know how accurate Pro Football Focus is, but they came out and said that Tennessee blitzed him 15 times. Boy, I don't know their definition of a blitz, but I would have said 5 or 6 is what I thought, just with the naked eye without charting it. So I didn't think Tennessee's game plan against him was very good. But see, here's my problem with that too, Caleb. You didn't get to him at all in the first half, so why don't you bring the heat in the second half? That's what bothers me. So that's why I think, in particular against Ohio State, but even Georgia, I thought they got out coached a little bit.
I'll just go so far as to say that they completely screwed up James Pearce's season. I was told he had a serious personal issue that happened in the offseason, and that's why he got the slow start. But I thought that from a schematic standpoint, and maybe that was more of it, but from a schematic standpoint, he dropped into coverage way too often. Mm-hmm. I still don't understand, and Jimmy, maybe you can help me. Why in the world an edge rusher like James Pearce is ever in a 4-point stance? I've never seen, I can't remember a great edge rusher in a 4-point stance, and that seemed to be his go-to. That made no sense to me. I just feel like they missed out on James Pearce for whatever reason or what combinations of reasons they just didn't get all they could have out of him.
They didn't, and I don't know how much. Now, I'm particularly bothered by him being in pass coverage.
Yeah.
Why are you taking an elite pass rusher and putting him in pass coverage? If you want to do it a couple of times, but it looked like he was in pass coverage more than that to me. So why would you rob somebody of that skill? And now here's the other thing too. I have been told he's a bit of a head case. So some of that may fall on him, his motivation or whatever. But I didn't think Tennessee he was better in 2023 than he was in 2024, right? Look at his numbers. Look at the impact. Now, we'll say this. There were some games where I heard people say, boy, he was a no-show. He did nothing. Well, he drew 3 holding penalties. So I got to say, hey, he had some impact. So I can't just look at the stats and say, with a blanket comment, he did nothing or he did a lot less, because there were times. And if you can draw a double team from an offense to block you, then theoretically you're helping free somebody else. So you got to look at some of those nuances. But I do remember this: he missed about 5 or 6 sacks where he had the quarterback dead to right and he just missed him. That's on him.
I agree.
Yes.
I wasn't told head case. I'll say this: when somebody comes to you though and says he really is a good kid, I promise, then you wonder if there's a head case going on, because you usually don't start when you ask about a guy and you say, well, first of all, he's a really good kid, despite what you may have heard. Go ahead, Caleb.
It's like when reminds me of when Kevin Garnett signed that record contract in '96 for Minnesota and said, it's not about the money. Okay. You know, guys, what we're seeing, though, I mean, we got to call this out. As good of a job as we're saying Tim Banks did, I mean, I go back through the history of Tennessee defensive coordinators, and I can think of about like 4 or 5 that would have called a better game against Georgia or Ohio State than Tim Banks would have. Say what you want about Jeremy Pruitt. He'd have brought pressure. We know John Chavis did nothing but bring pressure all the time, 100% of the time. Justin Wilcox liked to bring pressure. Isn't this kind of a red flag that, I mean, I literally just reeled off 3 defensive coordinators who I know straight up would have known to bring pressure in those 2 games when Tim Banks didn't do it.
But would they have been as good in the other 11 games Tennessee played? I don't know. See, I really like John Chavis and respect him. I thought he did an outstanding job as defense coordinator. You know what he had trouble with? Quarterback draw.
He also had a lot of trouble with those screen passes at Notre Dame.
Well, he did. And then somebody came up with 3rd and Chavis or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the LSU game when they put in a backup quarterback, I think his name was Matt Mauck, and he ran about 13 quarterback draws, and Tennessee never stopped him. My point is, defensive coordinators aren't perfect. Neither are offensive coordinators. I think they're like quarterbacks. They all have a bad game. They all have something you wonder about. Why in the world didn't he do that? But I have to look over 13 games or 12 games or 14 or however many they play. So yeah, I didn't like what Banks did in 2 of the games, but boy, the other 11 games, I thought he did a really nice job.
I'll look back at John Chavis, and yes, outstanding job. I wouldn't call him elite, because I felt like he would get out coached a couple of times a year. We mentioned the Notre Dame one, obviously the 2001 SEC championship game where he didn't adjust. Are we talking about a guy that's cut from the same cloth, a guy that's fundamentally sound, a guy that's going to do some really good things in Tim Banks, but maybe just get outfoxed a couple of times a year? Or the Georgia and Ohio State games more about talent?
Well, I definitely think the Ohio State game was about talent. Their receivers are a lot better than Georgia's receivers. And Carson Beck, if you give him all day to throw, is pretty good. But to my point about coordinators, Chip Kelly is revered as an offensive coordinator. How did he do against Michigan? He even admitted after the Michigan game he stunk, and he was hard-headed. And he kept trying to run against Michigan when he should have been throwing the football. So I just think there are times that coordinators, quarterbacks, whatever, just don't have good games. Is Banks going to call a great game in every game of the year? Probably not. Is he going to get beat by a team that's got 3 receivers like Ohio State with a quarterback that's hot? Yeah, probably. But I think, to me, there was a clear talent disparity. in Tennessee and Ohio State. Still doesn't excuse Tennessee for never covering the drag route or covering the back out of a backfield. I mean, that to me is a coaching. But getting back to this, I don't know. I just don't know how many offensive or defensive coordinators you can point to and say that guy was great every game throughout the season. I just think that's rare.
That's fair. I guess I would say at least make an adjustment during the game. That to me is kind of the salvation. If you come out with a bad game plan and you make an adjustment at halftime or whenever, then kudos. You absolved yourself of a bad game plan. I guess that's kind of how I look at it.
Well, that's why I referenced the Georgia game.
Yeah.
Because Tennessee, to me, did not make the adjustments in the second half. I'm going to ignore the numbers from Pro Football Focus because I'm having trouble believing them.
Hey, man. By the way, did I tell you they called me one time and asked me if I would be interested in breaking down football for them? I'm like, guys, I'm a reporter. I don't pretend to know the X's and O's like some sort of former coach. So that just tells you a little something about Pro Football Focus.
So they hired an 8th grader instead. See,
he was probably better than I would have been.
Well, and my point, I'll go to this. And the reason I bring that up is so I'm doing the Sunday morning show with Tim Irwin, and we're talking about the grades of the offensive line. And his naked eye view was way different from some Pro Football Focus ratings and rankings and how well they played, particular individuals. And so he said, what do they got, an 8th grader that's grading the offensive line? So that's why I mentioned 8th grade. He questioned the ability of some of the people that are doing this kind of work. And I think that's a fair question.
Well, my understanding, I'm not trying to rip anybody. Sorry, Caleb. My understanding is the business model is they put the best guys on the NFL because that's where the money is. Go ahead, Caleb.
Okay. Yeah, and well, there's some things they just can't account for, particularly with blocking. There's certain, so much of blocking, particularly in the interior, is complementary blocking. So your grade may struggle because you're blocking at an angle and not actually picking up a man. Jerome Carvin did that all the time. So Jerome Carvin's grades were terrible. And I think we all thought Jerome Carvin was really good. Jimmy, how about this? If I'm with Tim Banks, if I'm being fair, because, we brought up Chavis. One of the biggest red flags to me with Chavis was how long it took him to figure out offenses. It took him way too long to figure out Steve Spurrier. But we haven't seen that with Tim Banks yet. But if Tennessee goes into next year and elite quarterbacks are still torching him and he's not blitzing, don't we start to raise a red flag of, okay, why haven't you may not have, it may have been wrong that you didn't adjust in a game, but now you're not adjusting year to year. And isn't that a red flag at that point?
It would be. Yeah. And especially if it happens 5 or 6 times. Yeah. Yes. That I would agree with that.
Yeah, and so I think that was because I think we would all agree, right? That it took Chavis 4 years before he figured out the fun and gun and could slow it down.
Well, some teams never figured it out.
Yeah, but Chavis actually had the talent. Other teams didn't.
Well, you're right. They did have the talent. Their personnel in the 90s was outstanding on defense. You're right.
Well, so with Tim Banks, let me just get like a big picture thing because we've kind of danced all around it. We talked about how he's good. We've talked about how he's struggled at times. I mean, where would you rate him among others? To me, he's in the top 10 percentile or so. I think he's right up there. I'm not ready to go overboard and say elite yet.
Well, I don't know how assistant coaches get nominated for assistant coach of the year, but he has been nominated for that more than once. And that tells me his peers, if it is the peers, think highly of him. But I've also talked to some other coaches, college coaches, who think he's really good. And this is interesting too. So we just know Clemson fired their defensive coordinator and they got Tim Allen from Penn State to be their coordinator. So we'll see how much of an impact he makes at Clemson. But my deal is this. I don't think you just say, hey, we can find somebody better than Tim Banks. Boom, snap your finger. No, I don't think it's that easy to do that. And I also think that he's a better coordinator now than he was the first year he was at Tennessee. Now, having said that, I thought Tennessee's personnel that first year was not very good on defense. That was one thing that hurt them because they had so many players that left the program in the portal.
It's funny you bring that up, and I want to get to that. Portions of the program brought to you by Rick Terry Jewelry Design. They want to be your jeweler looking for affordable game day jewelry, a Tennessee tradition, rickterryjewelry.com. Again, rickterryjewelry.com. I felt like early with less talent, he was incredibly creative and risky at times in some of his defensive front twists and stunts and blitzes. I felt like this year he kind of thought he had it and played a little bit more vanilla. That's what I thought by watching with my eyeballs.
So I'll give you this one because he's retired, but I've had more than one coach say this to me. So I've known Mac Brown since he was the offensive coordinator at LSU in 1981. And I have talked with him a number of times. And he told me that if his offensive talent wasn't as good as the defense he was playing, he had to be more creative. He had to have a lot more reverses or different, just a different attack. He had to gamble. Okay. But if his offense was better than your defense, he could be more conservative, line up and just run at you because you couldn't stop him. I've had defensive coordinators that told me the same thing. If I got the defensive talent, I don't need to blitz a lot. If I got the defensive talent, I don't need to throw a whole lot of junk at a quarterback if my defense is better than your offense. So I think that's somewhat typical of coaches. If my talent's better than yours, I can be pretty vanilla and win anyway.
On that front, Jimmy, and we've asked this before, is Rodney Garner more important than Tim Banks as a coach for Tennessee because of the defensive line and the work he did?
Was Robin more important than Batman?
He wasn't in even the first movie, Jimmy. Come on. Are you going to play to my nerddom?
No, but wait, Tex Winter was more important than Phil Jackson on the Bulls.
They had 5 Robins. They only had 1 Bruce Wayne Batman.
Okay, well then I'll retract that statement. Question. So
Jimmy wasn't aware of Nightwing.
I think Rodney Garner is extremely important. I think he develops players. I like the way that he plays a lot of people as opposed to the offensive line, which doesn't develop talent like Rodney Garner does on defense. More important, how good of a defensive coordinator would Rodney Garner be? Or how good of a defensive coordinator is Tim Banks without Rodney Garner? That's a really good question. I don't have a great answer to that. But Garner's he's the best defensive line coach they've had over there since Dan Brooks. And so I'll say this. I don't think there's a better coach as a position coach on Tennessee's staff than Rodney Garner, but I'm hesitant to say he's more important than Tim Banks.
So let me ask you this. Banks closing in on that decision, he's going to stay at Tennessee. The other 2 coaches that are on expiring contracts are Willie Martinez and Mike Eckler. You think Tennessee will make a change there? They good?
I don't know. I'm not sure if they do. To be honest with you, I've not been a huge fan of Willie Martinez, but I thought this past year with a whole bunch of new bodies, they did a good job with McCoy. Gibson wasn't a new body, but I thought he played well. They got a lot out of Will Brooks, who was a walk-on. So I thought he had a pretty good year as a secondary coach. So I'm not sure they're going to make a move there. Eckler on special teams primarily. He's got tight ends. No, he doesn't have tight ends. What's his position?
Outside linebackers.
Outside linebacker.
Teams.
Well, good gravy. I could coach Arian Carter.
Well, Arian Carter's not that good in pass coverage. That concerns me a little bit.
That's true.
He's a great athlete, and I love the way he runs. He needs to get better in that regard. Special teams, I thought you were fine at kicker, at punter, your return game. I would give Eckler, to me, as an above average coach on your staff.
Okay.